Solomon's gift, it turns out, is a gift that he both already had and a gift that he wished to receive. In this passage, we also get glimpses, what I will call Old Testament flashbacks of two earlier stories. Now, I try to be careful about trying to make connections between one scripture and another, because there are times, I think, when I have seen and heard churches and sermons that just tried to shoehorn Jesus in everywhere. And I don't want to do that, but I think that there are a couple of connections here to some of the earlier stories that give us a little perspective on how things go. And the two stories that I want you to listen for to see if they jump out at you like they did at me are the story of Eden, and particularly the story of the fruit and the two trees in the middle of the garden, and the story of Abraham. So listen for how the story as it unfolds perhaps remind us of those two previous stories, Eden and the story of Abraham. But before we jump into the text for today, you notice that in our reading we read a little from chapter 2 and then we jumped over to chapter 3. It is as if there is 18 minutes and 30 seconds of erased tape here, not because someone is trying to hide something from us, but the lectionary sort of pole vaults over these to get to this important message that we have today. So I want you to take an opportunity at some time to go back and look at what is left out in the middle there. It is a less than sacred look at the beginning of Solomon's reign, lest you believe that Solomon was some holier than thou, wiser than all, and perfect person. Go back and read the rest of chapter 2, and you'll get a little more perspective on the humanity of Solomon. Because what happens in those verses that are left out is that even though the narrator says, and Solomon's reign was secure, his kingdom was secure, it turns out that in the rest of chapter 2, there's actually a few loose ends that Solomon takes care of at the beginning of his reign. One of them is the execution of a brother who has threatened him for the kingdom, of a priest that supported that, of Joab who betrayed his father David, and another person who apparently was on Homeland Security's watch list. But here's the one verse that you should hear so that you can appreciate God's ironic twist when it arrives in the part that we're reading today. Here's what happens. Bathsheba, Solomon's mom, is convinced by this brother who was all but prepared to take the throne. He'd done everything to win this throne, and yet somehow he does not get it. And he recognizes, or at least he says to his mother, that it is because the hand of God was in it for Solomon. But he comes to his mom and asks her to approach Solomon for a big favor. It happens to be the favor of choosing of a particular woman for his wife, which I suppose would have some political implications. And so Bathsheba falls for this, if you will, and goes to Solomon on the throne when it is freshly waxed from the transition, and he sits there, and his mother comes in to him, and in lieu of the throne, this brother asked for what you might call a consolation prize. And here's the verse in chapter 2, verse 20. As Bathsheba approaches the throne and Solomon speaks to her, she says, "I have one small request to make of you. Do not refuse me." Kind of reminds me of when people say, "I have a favor to ask of you. Will you grant it?" I'm not prone to grant favors without finding out what they are. But she says, "Do not refuse me." And the verse says, "And the king said to her," that is Solomon, "Make your request, my mother, for I will not refuse you." Okay, catch that irony there. Basically, anything you want, it's yours, he says to her. She asks, it infuriates him. And so rather than refusing to grant the request, he just has his brother executed. That way you don't have to worry about the wedding. Would have given her, but now you're dead, can't do that. So sorry. Solomon moves on. 3 other people dead. Now the throne is secure. All right, so there's where we pick up with our story today. And at the beginning, it sounds at the first reading in verse 3, where it says, Solomon sacrificed and offered incense at the high places, as if Solomon is doing extra credit work here. As if not only does Solomon follow in the footsteps of his father David, but he added some bonus sacrifices and burning of incense. Well, he is not doing extra credit work, and it is not pleasing to God. Because as the wilderness preparation for the unified worship and practice of the nation that comes into the land of milk and honey and claims its right, the location of the temple, which will eventually be built in Jerusalem, which in essence is the opposite of the traveling tabernacle worship that typifies the sojourning nation of Israel up to this point, sacrificing at the high places is both an indication of Solomon's folly and of his eventual failure. This is against what God had desired. But the narrator tells us that he went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the principal high place. It was the most favored and famous high place. And the narrator goes on to say Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. 1,000 burnt offerings on this altar? How many times do you suppose he did that? Whatever it is, whether this is hyperbole or truly 1,000 burnt offerings, it accentuates in its repetitiveness the futility of offering these sacrifices in a place where God has said, this is not the place to which I am calling you. And yet, in verse 5, the very next verse, Solomon goes to the high places, Gibeon offers sacrifice, thousands at a time. And then the narrator says, at Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night. The very same location. When Solomon is at the height of his folly and failure, God approaches with an unbelievable offer made even more unimaginable by the very place where it is being done because of what Solomon is doing. Now, here's what I want you to think about. Here's a dream that Solomon has and a conversation with God. I came across these words the other day, and they made me think of this particular story. Here are the words. Dreams are the answers to questions that we haven't yet figured out how to ask. Dreams are the answers to questions that we haven't yet figured out how to ask. Now, does that mean every crazy dream that you had is a message from God? No. Graham Foster straightened me out on that this morning and told me about a crazy dream that he had. And I said, I don't think that's what we're talking about here. He said, good, I'm glad to hear that. But here, this conversation with God perhaps is a way of helping Solomon move to the place that he needs to be to become what God intended for him to be. Because in the dream, God says to Solomon, ask what I should give you. Anything. Your wish is my command. Basically, it sounds like God is saying, precisely at the time and the place where Solomon is most obviously disobedient. What kind of God is this, who comes to us in the midst of our disobedience and offers us such an unimaginable gift? Solomon's wish, his answer to God's request, begins with a story of sorts. Rather than just coming right out and say, here's what I want for Christmas, God, Santa. Solomon begins with a story. And the story begins with thank you. Solomon said, you have shown great steadfast love to your servant, my father David, because he walked before you in faithfulness and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward you, and you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne today. Thank you for the gift of my ancestry and the grace that you are continuing to pour out on us. Thank you for all that I have, Solomon says. And after thank you comes the next part of the story, which is, I'm pretty sure I'm not doing this right. That's what he says. He says, and now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in the place of my father David. Although I am only a little child, I do not know how to go out or to come in. Certainly hyperbole here. Solomon is not a young teenager, an adolescent. But he does recognize that there is something that he has not quite figured out. And the reference to going out and coming in, I think I mentioned that a few weeks ago, is really about the process of worship, about the practice of faith. How we gather and around the things that we gather, the things we gather around, are the coming in. And the going out are the what now? What are we going to do about it? What is the purpose of coming to worship? It is to send us out to do the work to which God has called us. So there's coming in and there's going out as a part of worship. And here Solomon, who's offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the high altar at Gibeon, says, I don't know what I'm doing here. I need your help. Help me, he says. Thank you, help me. This he recognizes as the key to both faith and his practice and leadership of God's people. And then the third part of the story is this. He says, and your servant is in the midst of the people whom you have chosen, a great people, so numerous they cannot be numbered or counted. Ding, 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 ding. Old Testament flashback alert. Abraham. Genesis 15, 17, 22. What was it God said to Abraham? I will make your descendants greater than the stars in the sky, unable to be counted like the sands on the beach. Yeah. Solomon says it's finally come true. The nation of Israel, which started out as little of nothing with Abraham and Sarah, made its way into Egypt, became slaves to Pharaoh and the Egyptians, made their way through the wilderness, and now here they are in the promised land, and they are so many they can't even be counted. And then we finally get to Solomon's request, to his answer, which was prefaced by the story of, thank you, help me, your promise has already been fulfilled, your promise to Abraham. We finally get to Solomon's request. And here's what he asked for. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil, for who can govern this your great people? Ding, 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 ding. Old Testament flashback number 2. Discerning between good and evil. What's that all about? It's the same issue in the Garden of Eden with the 2 trees. The one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that the woman said when the serpent told her, you're not going to die if you eat this. You're going to become, quite literally, gods. We translate that and say you become like God. The Hebrew says you will become God. That is, the desire to become equal with God is what was wanted in the Garden of Eden, and Solomon asked for a second bite at this apple with a little bit of a different twist. A holy do-over of Genesis 3, if you will, and the difference seems to be that Solomon's request for a bite of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is made not within the context of grasping for equality with God, to quote Paul from the 2nd chapter of Philippians, but was done for the good of the people. You see, Solomon says, who can govern this your great people? That's why I need the knowledge of good and evil, the ability to discern between right and wrong. It is not for self, not for self-promotion and self-gain, for riches or power or influence or ego. It is for the people. And for that reason, and perhaps that reason alone, God is pleased to answer Solomon's final answer with a yes, and grants him not only that, but all of the other things that he asked for, that he didn't ask for, and gives him the one thing he asked for. So Solomon's gift, first of all, is a gift that he already had, partially, and a gift that he recognized he needed more. His gift was in knowing that all is gift, and all prayers begin with thanks. Thank you for all that I have, he says in the beginning of his answer to God, knowing that God already has all and gives all. Solomon also knows what he doesn't know. That is, Solomon knows that he's got a little bit of wisdom, but not enough. It requires a little bit of wisdom to know that you don't have enough wisdom and to know that you need to ask for more. It is the fool who believes everything is already figured out, who doesn't need wisdom. It is the person who has a little bit of wisdom who is capable of recognizing the need for greater wisdom. So Solomon knows not only what he knows, but he knows what he doesn't know, or he knows that there are many things that he doesn't know, and he's wise enough to know that he needs more wisdom. And his gift is also wanting this gift for the community, for the good of the people. The difference between the first time around is that this request, this second bite at the apple, if you will, is for the good of the people. It transcends both the self of Solomon and the current circumstances in which he finds himself. That is Solomon's gift. And so I ask you, knowing what Solomon asked for, knowing this story, knowing the humanity of Solomon, knowing the rest of the story, knowing that we're going to get to grace and resurrection, what have you asked for, and what do you ask for this congregation, for this community, for your family, for yourself, for the world? What do you ask for? I will close with what appears to be a prayer. When I first got it, I thought it was the words of a hymn because it comes from the United Methodist Hymnal. Someone just sent it to me and said, "This is from the United Methodist Hymnal." First I thought it was a hymn, and then I said, it doesn't rhyme. It can't be a hymn. Right? Listen to this. From the cowardice that dares not face new truth, from the laziness that is contented with half-truth, from the arrogance that thinks it knows all truth, good Lord, deliver me. From the cowardice that dares not face new truth, from the laziness that is contented with half-truth, from the arrogance that thinks it knows all truth, good Lord, deliver me. Sounds like a prayer Solomon may have offered.